Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to the More Lecture Series. We're about halfway through our series. Our next talk is on September 25th, when Professor Joseph Bowulia from Victoria University of Wellington will be here. But today we have Wesley Wildman from Boston University, where he is a professor and he convenes the Religion and Science program. He has written or co-edited 17 books, including being the author of a 7-volume set on the philosophy of religion that's about to be completed and published with Oxford University Press. He's published many more journal articles than that. Wesley's unique, and sometimes people think there are two Wesleys. So I remember when Wesley came last year, I was talking to Greg and I said, oh, Wesley Wildman's here, he's going to talk about computer modeling in the study of religion. And Greg said, oh, I know Wesley Wildman, but it must be a different guy. I know the philosopher. But it's actually the same Wesley Wildman. And that's exactly why Wesley's unique. So he works on both sides of the humanities and the sciences. And he's also unique because he's a philosopher of religion who actually studies religion. But he's particularly interested in the cognitive and evolutionary and psychological study of religion. He also founded the Institute for the Biocultural Study of Religion, and he recently founded the Institute for the Center for Mind and Culture, of which he is now the executive director. He is also the founding co-editor, along with Patrick McNamara and Richard Sosis, of Religion, Brain, and Behavior, which quickly became the most important journal in the scientific study of religion. And so now I'll turn it over to Wesley.
Well, thank you for having me. So very nice to be here. I'm especially pleased to be inflicting an Australian accent on a bunch of New Zealanders. It's very pleasurable for me. So, the theme for this evening is integrating the sciences and the humanities in the study of religion. This is something that I advocate, so I'm not attacking it. I'm supporting the idea, and I'd like to explain why. I'm a philosopher of religion, as you've just heard, and I specialise in the scientific study of religion. So that means I'm a humanities scholar who spends a lot of time with the social and the natural sciences, trying to think about them in philosophical terms to produce decent interpretations of phenomena that we're willing to call religious. Religious experience, religious beliefs, religious behaviours, everything that you might consider under the heading of religion. So I started out in this direction thinking that this was going to pay off. It's an interesting idea. It should make the study of religion better if you pay attention to what the scientists have to say about it. And I've been satisfied by that. I think that's been a good intuition and it's worked out well. I've learned a lot about religion from scientists. But along the way I discovered that the opposite was true as well, that the sciences require humanities study of religion in order for them to be excellent. It's an interesting fact that I hadn't anticipated that, probably because I'm coming from the humanities side. I hadn't realised that we have a lot to offer. I was ready to understand that we needed to learn from scientists, but over the years I've become willing to insist that scientists operating without the benefit of humanities interpretations of religion often produce less than stellar work. So the humanities have something crucial to offer as well. This suggests, I think, that what we need is integration of the sciences and the humanities in the study of religion. That's not just about religion departments and what happens in universities. It's also about public discourse about religion, where I think both the sciences and the humanities have crucial roles to play. So in the course of this lecture, I'm going to describe why it is that the humanities are essential for excellence in the study of religion, why it is that the sciences are essential for excellence in the study of religion, and I'll give lots of examples as I go along. And then how it is that you can combine them without undue stress. That's an issue, because in some places it is very stressful trying to put them together. And finally, implications for religious studies departments and for the public discourse about religion. So I'm going to start off talking about a couple of stories. These stories come from my personal experience and they have a lot of energy behind them. I'm probably going to have to mute that energy just a little so that I don't confuse the point. In any event, you'll start to understand what I mean by that as I get started. Here's the first story. I recently had cause to speak to the chair of a religion department. The topic was what's necessary in a religion department for the religion department legitimately to call itself excellent in its coverage of religion. Now that is a struggle for any religion department because there's so many religious traditions, there's so many areas of the world, there's so many periods and there's so many approaches. It's very difficult to cover all of it, so you need to be selective. And that means, of course, that religion departments by and large will try and find a focus or an area of concentration or specialty, something in order to give some integrity and coherence to their efforts in teaching and research. Well, it's a difficult conversation, but here's what he said. I quote, "A religion department can be excellent by focusing exclusively on humanities approaches without any coverage of the scientific study of religion." He might have expected me to agree with him because I'm a humanities person myself, but I didn't agree with him, not even close. My reasoning in that conversation pointed first to Michael Stausberg's book called Contemporary Theories of Religion. Many of you all know that book. It's a survey of theories in the last 25 years or so, and virtually all of the theories in that book are deeply informed by the sciences, the social and the biological sciences, evolutionary religious studies, neurosciences, and so on. This is an indication of where the energy is coming in theories of religion in the last 25 years. It's coming from the science side. It's not just books, they can be biased. I don't think that book's biased, by the way. I think its selection is fair as to who's making the real advances in theories about religion. But there's other things as well. Most of the publications, there's lots of publications on both sides of this divide, but the publication rate of citation rate is much higher, significantly higher in the sciences than in the humanities. So that's an indication of energy around engagement with each other, fighting over theoretical issues, trying to interpret complicated issues in religion. So scientific study of religion is far, far higher in its citation rate than humanities study of religion. And that's with the split in publications about 50-50. So it's not like it's biased just because of size. There's something going on in the scientific study of religion. In the course of this article, I hope I'll make the case that you actually need to pay attention to both sides. Now, that department chair might have been correct if it were the case that we were never going to talk about religion as such. For example, we could speak just about religion in particular places and times, do micro-studies, the way an anthropologist who of the cultural anthropology kind would. You go to a particular place, you study that place in that time, in that context, very, very carefully and deeply, and report on that descriptively. Don't evaluate, nothing like that. That tells you actually very little about religion as such. It's about this particular thing. You wouldn't even need the word religion to describe it. And I believe earlier in this lecture series you heard from Rich Sosis, who made the case against this idea that you could do religious studies without talking about religion. But it is out there, it's a movement. And I think maybe this chair comes from within that movement, who thinks that religion is a colonialist construction that distorts its subject matter more than it illumines it. So we're better off not using the word. But that's a recipe for the end of religion departments. If you don't have a thing called religion as such, then you shouldn't have a department dedicated to it. You just shouldn't. All of those people can do their wonderful work in a religion, their wonderful study of religion inside a history department or an anthropology department or somewhere else in the university. If you've got a religion department, there has to be something like religion as such. As you'll see, I think there is. Well, here's a second story. John introduced me as one of the co-editors of Religion, Brain and Behaviour. That role in that journal leads me to have a lot of contact with people submitting papers for publication in the scientific study of religion. My co-editors and I were impressed by the frequency with which scientists make pretty serious errors in talking about religion, to the point that we sometimes just have to laugh at how bad the errors are. These are serious problems. People characterising religion in a howler-inducing way because they don't know anything about the humanities study of religion. We had to impose a policy that insists that people handle religion in a howler-free way in order to be worthy of publication in our journal. And as far as I know, we're the only scientific study of religion who insists on taking account of the humanities in that way. All of those debates about religion, they happen inside the humanities. They've been happening inside the humanities for 120 years already. They are very subtle, very sophisticated, very important discussions of the meaning and scope of religion. But when a scientist sits down to do a study and they don't know anything about the humanities study of religion, they think, well, I'm going to need to operationalise this concept of religion. I'll do that using this instrument, say they want to do a survey or something. So this survey will define what I mean by religion. And then I'm going to talk about religion in my interpretation of the results, and I'll have something to say about religion. That's obviously fallacious reasoning. It's painfully wrong to assume that one particular construct in a psychological instrument such as a survey accurately represents religion without further comment. If you use the word religion, you incur an obligation to explain how it is that what you're doing measures up to the object, the logical object that you're referring to when you use the word. So I've got no objection to operationalising concepts for the purposes of study, but you need to put in the proper caveats to indicate that religion could be much more complex, much more multifaceted, much more ambiguous than can be possibly suggested in one particular research instrument. All right, both stories express what I think are deeply mistaken views about how to do the study of religion. Behind those views, I think, there's a tragic kind of arrogance and parochialism. You have to get out of your own cave now and then in a university and see what people in other fields say about what you study. It can't possibly be the case that we're the only people who know what we're saying when we talk about religion. You have to expect that others will have insights that are relevant to what we've got to say. So, I'm anti-parochial and I'm anti-arrogant, and I say that with a tremendous amount of confidence. All right, so irony in place, let's continue. Why are scientific approaches necessary for excellence in the study of religion? Fair question. Well, consider the vast majority of groups that we're willing to call religious have got a whole bunch of things in common. They've got rituals, traditions, authorities, sacred places, sacred texts, sacred objects. They've got moral regulations. They've got 1,000 things. Not 1,000, but certainly a solid dozen things in common that occur in almost all groups. Now, there are some marginal cases where you don't see those things. That leads to a need to define religion using family resemblance characteristics, the way family members aren't exactly the same but have some things in common. That approach is probably the right way to define religion, rather than saying religion is belief in supernatural agents. Well, yeah, but not everyone believes in supernatural agents who are religious, and there are some philosophical orientations to religion that are anti-supernaturalist, so that's not going to work, is it? And same with every other definition of a necessary condition for religion. None of those things work. That's the result of 120 years of fighting in religious studies about this issue. So they do, however, have recurring features that are almost universal, not completely, but nearly universal. How on earth are you going to explain that? If you limit yourself to micro-studies, you never get the bigger view. If you step back and do the bigger view, and see religion as such, thinking of 1,000 different places and times, you're confronted with structures of similarity. How are you going to interpret those structures? How are you going to interpret those recurring features? The answer is that the humanities have never succeeded in doing that. The best they've come up with is these structuralist interpretations which are highly speculative and have nothing to do with biology. And they have been roundly criticised by post-structuralist thinkers, and I think post-structuralist thinkers have effortlessly won the day in that fight. You can't just speculate your way to an understanding of common features. You need to take account of evolutionary theory, of biology, of brains. You need to worry about recurring features of social groups that have to solve recurrent problems. Every social group has a means of exchange. Every social group regulates sexual activity. There are all kinds of recurring features in social groups because there are recurring problems that need to be solved. So between the social commonalities and the biological foundations, you come up with an explanation for the recurring features in religions across the world, things you're prepared to call religion. That's the way to do it. You've got no other way of getting a decent explanation that can survive criticism and produce testable hypotheses. There's actually, I think there's a very important lesson there for humanities people. If you haven't been thinking about evolutionarily stabilisation of the human species to make them just perfect for religion, if you haven't been thinking in those terms, it can seem very shocking to see that scientists in some other field who know nothing about religion are taking over your territory and giving explanations for how religion comes to be, that is, how it evolves and how it functions. This is a big tension in the humanities study of religion. They're aware of that happening and they feel, oh no, this is one more example of the sciences taking over the humanities. We do not want to lose our territory, our role, which is legitimately understood by humanities experts such as myself as important. Really is important for me to think philosophically about the content of ideas that show up in religion. For example, it's an interesting example. In religion, people use philosophical reasoning to regulate the teaching and conveyance of ideas across the generations. That's called theology. And if it's done on behalf of a religious institution, such as a church or a synagogue or some larger tradition, then it's called confessional theology because it takes as its starting point the fundamental truth about the ideas and it just tries to understand their coherence, their compatibility and so on. But those ideas are important outside the context of religious studies, of confessional theology also. They're just interesting. Ideas about life after death, if you look at them across cultures, or ideas about ultimate reality, or about the human condition, what kind of problems we've got and how religion might help to solve them. These are recurring themes. Do we learn anything about reality by thinking about these ideas? Or that would be a question for a philosopher of religion. And that's the way I work as a philosopher of religion, in a trans-religious way. I don't work on behalf of religious communities when I do theology or philosophical theology of that kind. I work on behalf of the university, just trying to understand these ideas. But I've found, once again, that I can't just happily do that without paying attention to the sciences. The sciences are necessary for me to understand how those ideas work. Why do people believe they're being watched by someone who can evaluate their moral behaviour? Tons of experiments have demonstrated that this is what people in fact think, and there are formulated beliefs in lots of religious traditions that confirm that that's the case. So we need to understand how we get that way. We need to understand what evolutionary theory, what the origins of morality have to say about the nature of our minds that lead us to be that way. So from my point of view, philosophy of religion, a humanities discipline, cannot get very far in the understanding of religion, religious beliefs, behaviours, experiences, anything, unless it pays attention to the sciences in detail, at depth, and all of the relevant sciences on any particular topic. So that set of 6 volumes that John mentioned in the introduction, they are philosophy of religion, operating in a trans-religious mode, so the university is its social home, not any religious tradition. And those volumes each take a topic: religious experience, religious language, ultimate reality, human condition, whatever it is. They take a topic and they study it using all of the humanities disciplines and all of the relevant science disciplines. That's the right way to do it, I think. If I cut out the science disciplines and just focus on the humanities stuff, I cannot get to the root of my own subject. Difficult for humanities experts to hear this, but I think it's true. So this is why I think scientific approaches are necessary for the study of religion. But by the same token, humanities approaches are necessary. So that's the next stop on our way through this lecture. The social realities that we're willing to call religion involve those common features that I mentioned earlier. Who knows what those features are? Who knows how to describe them? Who knows the details about how they operate? Who knows the history of them? The humanities people know that stuff. There is zero chance that a scientist can ever hope to stabilise the object of inquiry by just on an afternoon doing a literature review to find out what a religious tradition is. That's not going to happen. That's absurd behaviour. Scientists are prone to it, I admit. So when I say absurd, I don't mean non-existent. It does exist, but it's bad behaviour. What you need to do is pay attention to what humanities people have said about that. For over a century, they've been learning how to describe these things in incredibly intricate detail. So you're never going to be able to stabilise the object of study for a scientific inquiry unless you take, in religious studies, unless you take account of what the humanities have learned about religion. I made the case earlier that you can't get anywhere unless you pay attention to their debates over the definition of the concept of religion. That's true too. But right now I'm talking about something different. It's stabilising the object of study. A ritual. What is ritual? It's too complicated a question for a scientist to answer for the purpose of a paper. You need to plant that scientific study in the context of humanities' study of ritual, which, by the way, is incredibly sophisticated and interesting. So humanities are necessary because there's no other way to stabilise the object of study. Now, scientists are quick to point out when humanities people make errors, when they're not up to date on something. You see humanities people talking about love, for example. But we know a tremendous amount about love from the neurosciences. 3 separate systems of love: sexual attraction, infatuation, and long-term bonding. These 3 different structures have different neurotransmitters and different functions and different time lags. We know about this now from the sciences. So if someone wants to talk about love from the humanities perspective, fine, but you're backing yourself into irrelevance by not paying attention to what the sciences have to say, right? Well, so the scientists are quick to point out flaws in humanities discussions of this kind. But the scientists themselves are making the mistakes I described earlier. And humanities people are not as quick to point out those mistakes because they're in neglect mode. They're not paying attention to the scientific results. They should be pointing out the mistakes in the sciences, holding the sciences accountable for what they say about religion or ritual or tradition or religious experience or anything. You'd think that'd be appealing to humanities people because they keep losing these battles in universities where the sciences and STEM disciplines are prized and the humanities disciplines wind up being marginalised and underfunded and all they get is part of a library and an office. But they don't get into it very enthusiastically. I really think it's an opportunity not to be missed. If you can attack scientists for carelessness, it could be fun, couldn't it? I just see all these religious studies scholars sitting around plotting their next move. Like, who can we go after this week? And then you've got these famous blogs that point out howlers committed by scientists who are studying religion. Well, I'm sure all of the scientists who study religion in this room today never make mistakes, so don't worry, you're safe. But the humanities people, I think, should go after your colleagues. I once read a proposal for research in the psychology of religion. It was going to say something about religious practices. It was intending to make inferences about religion as such. How was it going to do that? By looking at one particular subgroup within a sect, Christian sect in Malaysia, just one tiny little group. That's interesting work to study one tiny little group, very interesting work. But to say that you're learning something about religion from that without any qualifications, again, it's just a fallacy. It's a big mistake. Any amount of knowledge of the humanities study of religion would have saved that psychology of religion research project from ridicule. So now, I hope I've begun to make a case, which could be made much more complex than I have done, that you need the humanities and the sciences if you're going to do the study of religion in excellent fashion. Making that case presents a practical issue immediately to anyone who understands anything about universities. How on earth are you supposed to put scientific approaches and humanities approaches together in the same department? How's the same university unit supposed to comprehend these things which are so often kept separate? That's a non-trivial issue to solve, institutionally, emotionally for people. Humanities feel pretty hard done by. You've heard about the crisis of the humanities that I intimated earlier. The crisis of the humanities in the religion department means that humanities people are defensive about territory. They don't want to cede any more of it than has already been ceded to the sciences. But the sciences don't even pay attention to the humanities. They just roll on, getting more and more money, more and more prestige, more and more control, eventually backing the humanities subjects into a corner where they have to fight for their own survival. This is a terrible situation for the humanities to be in. So you can see that there's a certain motivation against welcoming the sciences to come in and invade your territory even further. The scientists, for their part, I've found to be much more friendly and open to talking to me, a humanities person, helping me learn things, teaching me things patiently, every now and again learning something from me. I found them much more open, but I think it's a question of them being so much more confident. They're confident in their institutional value, in their position. They don't feel like they have to fight for their survival. So they can comfortably talk to me, a humanities person, and not suffer any fear or regret, apart possibly from actually meeting me and discovering that he's a difficult person to talk to or work with or something. But apart from that, it works for them. They can do it. It's easy. I never would have been able to do what I do as a philosopher of religion if it hadn't been for a tremendous number of patient scientists who've been willing to work with me, write with me, conduct research with me, teach me, and so on. Hugely grateful for them. So, given that there are these problems, integrating sciences and humanities in real-world university life, I think a fair question is to ask how we're supposed to do it. Or is it even possible? I've had some experiences in my life that have helped me believe, with a tremendous amount of confidence, that putting the sciences and the humanities together in the study of religion is a natural and easy thing to do. I don't mean institutionally now, I mean conceptually. So for many years I've been running a PhD program in the scientific study of religion. This program has put me in touch with these incredibly talented young people, PhD students, who are trying to find a way to put the humanities and the sciences together in their study of religion. These people are getting much better training than I ever got from the dozen faculty that mentor them, plus the many dozens of other scientists who help out in the process. It's a fairly large program. They're getting better training than I ever got, and they're bowling me over with how compelling the unification of scientific and humanities approaches can be. It's obvious to them that you put it together. You have to put both sides together. It's just obvious. Because every time they stop incorporating the sciences or stop incorporating the humanities, they can feel the quality of their argument deteriorating. So they've learned to follow the evidence where it leads. I want to study, say, religious experiences. Well, what kind? That's the humanities question, really, because it's incredibly complex territory. So you pick a kind, and then you ask yourself, what disciplines are going to be relevant to help me understand this? And then you're going to have humanities disciplines, you're going to have the neurosciences, you're going to have psychology, you're going to have sociology, you're going to have evolutionary theory. All of these things are going to be relevant to understanding this particular type of religious experience. And they're unafraid of being ignorant and dummy learners trying to figure out what psychologists, if they don't know anything about psychology, have to say about this. They're impressive. It's important work. So I know from experience after experience of this kind that it isn't a problem conceptually combining scientific and humanities approaches to the study of religion. Another experience has to do with my own collaborative research. I mentioned before that lots of people have been teaching me science over the years very patiently. The most impressive thing about that is my willingness as an expert in something to be a dummy in something else for a little while, and then take what I need from that in order to improve what I do in my home turf. That's a challenge emotionally, but it's okay for professors to feel stupid. It's just fine, and I've come to enjoy that feeling because I know I'm learning something. I recommend it to you all. But the collaborative research process has been, in the end, a two-way exchange. Scientists have learned from me in writing with us, together in teams, writing. We found that everything we do is better when we combine our efforts. It's true I don't know as much about the sciences as I should. And it sure is true that they don't know as much about the humanities study of religion as they should. But when we work together, the quality of our work is just obviously superior. It's tremendously improved over what we could do alone. So I've learned that I can't work on what I do by myself. I have to work in teams. So in this PhD program that I just mentioned, we train people how to do teamwork. You just don't do that in the humanities. You really don't. You're by yourself with an archive or a library or something, sitting down in a bathtub trying to have clear ideas. Whatever you're doing as a humanities person, it's not teamwork, but there has to be teamwork to do religion well. To study religion well, you need to work in teams. So we have to train people to do teamwork because they come into this humanities PhD in science and religion not knowing anything about teamwork. They get good at it. They get really good at it. So we publish papers like scientists publish papers with 10 authors sometimes, or 2 or 3 or 4 authors quite often. So from my practice as a collaborative researcher and my experiences as a teacher of talented young people, I'm confident that it is possible to put science and religion together in the way, put humanities and the sciences together in the way you study religion. Unfortunately, I have to report something. The PhD program that I've been running, although these many years, is coming to an end. This is because Boston University's just gone through a review process and has changed the way it thinks about how the religion department should operate in graduate study in religion. This is a very sad story that I'm telling you from my point of view and from the point of view of the students and the many faculty involved in this program. For many years, decades, the Boston University Religion Department has been the guardian of the study of religion in the university as a whole. Not just what happens in its turf inside the department, but in the university as a whole. So what was happening in sociology or economics or in the School of Theology or in the medicine school, public health, wherever it was, they would nurture it and help it along and so forth. But in this review process, the university administration asked the religion department to pay more attention to its own skill set, its own scope of expertise. In other words, changing the concept of being a shepherding department for everything happening in the university to focusing on what it does in its own department, in its PhD program. Unfortunately, for the scientific study of religion, the number of people in our religion department who do the scientific study of religion is 0. And since they now have to focus on what they do in their own department, they can do brilliant work in the areas where they're strong, but they can no longer support what was going on in the scientific study of religion in the rest of the university. I consider that to be a tragedy and a misstep. Eventually it'll change, because eventually that religion department will have to hire people in the scientific study of religion in order to be credible. And when that happens, they're going to want to start PhD training in that. But in the meantime, we'll lose continuity that we've had for many years with the oldest and largest PhD program in science and religion in the world. And to lose that because of an administrative decision of this kind is really painful. It's also kind of stupid, I think. They're going to have to reinvent the wheel and have to be done later. So there you go. This is real-world academic politics. It's sometimes painful, but in this process, I remind myself that universities typically, especially in administrative fights, fight over almost nothing. There's almost nothing at stake in the big picture of things. What really matters is war, disease, child sex trafficking, you know, all of these other things that I work on in the Centre for Mind and Culture that John talked about in the introduction. Fighting over whether or not a particular area gets covered in a PhD in religious studies really isn't worth the effort. So I've encouraged my faculty colleagues not to worry too much. Maybe we can find another home in the university. We'll see how that works. But in the meantime, we move on. The politics, the ideology is what's causing the problem of putting science and religion, science and humanities together. It's not a conceptual problem. They're just, if you followed the argument that I've given you, there just is no conceptual issue here. You have an ideological issue, a very pointed one and a painful one where humanities scholars have legitimate gripes about being marginalised in the research universities of our world. But it's still just a political problem. All right, now, in concluding, I'm going to ask what all of this might mean for religious studies departments and what it might mean for wider discourse about religion in the general public. So here's another story about realities in religion departments. I've gotten to know many religion departments in my travels around the world. Several of them I know are full of professors who don't want to teach the Introduction to Religion class. Every subject, every department has an intro class, intro to psychology, introduction to philosophy, and admittedly they're not that popular, but they're pretty important classes for defining what your department is about. So even if you don't want to teach them, you certainly want to find someone good to teach them, and you want to recruit people for faculty who can teach those classes. But these religion departments I'm talking about adjunct out the teaching of that class. That is, they hire sometimes a postdoc or maybe even a PhD student from outside their department to come in and teach the Intro to Religion class because there's no one in the department who wants to teach it. Often this is because of what I was speaking about earlier. Religion isn't a thing in the post-colonial perspective. It's a distorted, modernist construct that you have to make a political protest against. So there's no way you're going to be affiliated with teaching religion. So you step right away from it. Just you'll feel more comfortable if you can do your micro-studies. Oh, that's fine, but you're a department in a university. And as a department in a university, you have to stand up and take responsibility for the name of your department. If there is a religion department, there has to be a reason for that. You express the reason in, among other ways, when you teach that Introduction to Religion class. So that's absurd, I think. But here's the real absurdity. One of these departments, I know one of the adjuncts who's been brought in to teach this class. He described to me the way he was summoned by the department chair in a friendly way, not a threatening way, to come in and describe to the faculty in the religion department what his approach was this year when he was teaching the religion course, the Intro to Religion class. Fair enough. The religion department's entitled to know how their subject is being taught. And he said, well, he was trying to combine scientific and humanities approaches. He was talking about the evolution of religion and how, against the background of an evolutionary understanding of religion, you can talk about the way religion is incredibly plastic and gets expressed in formidably, intricately different ways across the world's cultures and across time. How beautiful it is, he tried to make the case, that you've got a religious stabilising of human cognition and sociality that produces religion, but when you actually see the fruits of that, it's really diverse and culturally specific, and that was his approach. One of the senior professors there, who never wants to teach that course, cleared his throat just like that, got the attention of the room, leaned forward in his chair and said, in a bullying kind of way, I think, "Did I just hear you say evolution?" This is a humanities person who won't teach the intro to religion, but is perfectly ready to criticise someone without knowing the actual content, just based on the presence of a word. That's the mark of an ideologically driven political problem. That's the problem that needs to be solved, not the conceptual problem of putting humanities and scientific approaches together in the study of religion. Now, practically speaking, this goes beyond university politics. It affects, I think, universities, but it also affects the general public. It certainly affects self-understanding of people in the study of religion. If you're in a university department, if you're taking this type of argument seriously, you have to rethink what you're doing. You can't call yourself strictly humanities anymore, can you? You have to say you're a radically interdisciplinary study of something like religion. Just like in political economy or other radically interdisciplinary areas of human inquiry. Changes the way you talk about yourself, the way you set up your web pages, the way you run your introductory classes. It also changes faculty recruitment. You have to look for people who are capable of teaching across the humanities-science divide when you're talking about religion, if you really want to be excellent. Changes the way you set up curriculum. The university religion department that I was describing in that story just now, as I started this conclusion, has an average of 7 or 8 religion majors per year, and it's a university with well over 15,000 undergraduates. So the faculty easily outnumber their majors. This is a desperate problem, I would think, when you have to argue for the continuity of your department. If you're in this vast university and you can't get enough people interested in religion. Meanwhile, Ted Slingerland at the University of British Columbia is running his online class called The Science of Religion with over 10,000 registrations. 10,000 people. Moreover, this class that was being the Intro to Religion class that was taking account of both humanities and scientific approaches to religion has been wildly popular. It seems that incorporating the sciences and the humanities together in the study of religion could promise a solution to the problem of low undergraduate majors. It's actually pretty sexy, the science of religion. Undergraduates like it. It's fascinating. They feel like they're understanding something about themselves much more deeply than when they do the micro-studies approach that's so often done in humanities study of religion. Now, we need both, as I've said. But the scientific side of things, I think, can have a big impact on undergraduate recruitment. Now, all of that stuff tells you something about what matters to the general public. For one thing, the general public doesn't care about fights in university religion departments. There's just more of those privileged, protected people raving on about what's important. To hell with them all. Right? So that's why we need to make a shift as we finish up this lecture tonight away from universities into discussion in the general public. What happens in discussion in the general public? Well, I try to track this. I'm responsible in my centre for producing a lot of it, a lot of discussions in blogs about religion, a lot of films and so forth. What we find is that the scientists have a tremendous amount of cachet when it comes to public discourse about religion. Journalists would rather speak to a scientist than to 10 humanities specialists. Now, that might be partly because of a different skill set. Excuse me. Richard Dawkins is really, really good at talking about practically anything, but including religion. Press loves speaking to him because he's got colourful one-liners, because he can punch out an argument in just a few sentences within the attention span of the journalist and their imagined audience. Whereas you interview a humanities person like me, and we want to take you through 1,000 caveats and a 10-point argument, and it takes an hour to get through the introduction, and you talk the journalist into believing that it's worthless speaking to a humanities person. All right, that's a skill set issue. But humanities people can learn how to communicate in punchy ways about what they do. Why not? Scientists had to learn it. They have to learn it all the time, because if they don't raise money, they don't do research. So the art of writing the research proposal that wins you money is very similar to the art of communicating to a journalist. Very similar. So they get training in that area. If we could give humanities people training in that area, they'd probably be able to compete better. But as it is at the moment, they're really marginalised. Now, what does that mean? The practical effect of being marginalised in the public voice, the public discourse about religion, is that people don't know the subtleties they need to know in order to avoid making mistakes when they interpret religion. Classic example. In the United States where I work, there are a lot of people who generalise pretty quickly to all Muslims based on their understanding of extremist Muslim violence. They don't seem to feel any resistance when they move from one to the other. There is not a single humanities person on the planet studying religion who would make that mistake. It's such an obvious mistake to generalise from extremist Islamic religious violence to all Muslims. Moreover, in the United States, people do not make that mistake when it comes to Christianity. They know there are extremist Christians, such as the Ku Klux Klan, or on some interpretations, the Oklahoma City bombing and various other groups. They know about them, but they never mistake that for Christianity. Oh, that's just a bunch of wackos off to the side there who are causing a lot of trouble and have no compunction about killing innocent people, right? Oh, that difference is what needs to be explained. Why do they not make the generalisation error with Christianity, but they do make the generalisation error with Islam? Well, I don't think it's just blind prejudice. It could be just that, but I don't think so. I think it's especially to do with the fact that they just know a lot more about Christianity than they know about Islam. It's an ignorance issue. If they could find out more about Islam, its diversity, its rich heritage and so on, if they could know more about it, they would know that you can't generalise in that way, in the same way that they instinctively know that about Christianity. Now, I'm not just talking about religious people or Christians, I'm talking about the general public. Just because you live in a Christian culture, you tend to know more about Christianity. So this is an indication, I think, of the kind of effect that humanities people should have on public discourse. They're the ones who know about the diversity and complexity of religious traditions. They're the ones who can convey that to the general public. But they're probably going to have to team up with scientists to do it, because they really aren't good at communicating in public at the present time on the whole. So I think there's an obvious solution to all of these problems, and it is to follow through on the conceptual promise that I've described, integrate scientific and humanities approaches in the study of religion. Put them together. If you work on one side, ask yourself what the other side has to say about what you do, about your topic. I say that to your students, as professors and as members of the general public. It's not just university politics that's at stake here. There's a lot more hanging on this. Public understanding of religion is critical for national security, for international relations, for economic well-being, for a whole bunch of other processes that really matter in our world. Understanding religion is a key to be able to formulate solid policy that's going to make sense of those problems, those challenges that we face. Understanding religion cannot happen in an excellent way without the sciences and the humanities both combined and working together. That's the nub of my argument, and it matters not just in religion departments, but everywhere religion exists. And as we know, that's everywhere in the world. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have some time for questions. If you have a question, can you raise your hand and I can bring the microphone over to you?
What's his name again? Wesley, sorry, when you say religion, do you include all religions or just Eastern religion, theology, Christian religion? How do you, when you say religion, is that a blanket statement or just a selective question? Thanks.
I use the term religion in the way I described it in the lecture as a family resemblance concept, as a whole set of practices, beliefs, things that we're prepared to call religion that have commonalities across cultures, across historical eras. Not universal features exactly, but nearly universal features, such as beliefs, behaviours of particular kinds, rituals, moral regulation, and so on, worldviews. It's good to see John getting some exercise. He looks so overweight.
Two questions. Could you elaborate a little bit on social versus natural sciences in terms of your argument? And secondly, you mentioned a couple of times a time frame of 120 years or 100 years in terms of, in the humanities, people have been defining these things for that long. So you could elaborate a little on that time frame?
Yeah, good. First on the time frame, I think we have to go back. You can go back to the middle of the 19th century to see the discovery of books from the Vedas, particularly in the West from South Asia. And that's when the discussion of religion really took off in an academic way. But to me, the touchstones need to be people like Freud and Durkheim, who forced the issue of thinking about religion in general, theorising religion in general. Those two actually did that. That's why I'm using the 100, 120 year mark. Of course, people have been theorising religion for 2,500 years in the West. Plato theorised religion, for example. He's the first one to use the word. So there's a much longer history, but I wouldn't call that, I'd call that precedence for the modern academic study of religion. So there's a complicated timeline to be sorted through there, and that's just the West that I'm talking about. There are similar debates that you can talk about in South Asia and in East Asia. East Asia, for example, for a long time you've had Confucians, Taoists and Buddhists having imperial debates where they get favour and funding based on how well they perform in those debates. Well, that's a comparative religious exercise which raises the question of religion as such. It's a lot more than just the modern Western perspective that's at stake there. So there are other timelines to take account of as well. I hope that'll do as an answer for now. Now, the question about humanities, the social and the natural sciences. Religious studies in the humanities-controlled way in which it operates in most parts of the world at the moment is much friendlier to the social sciences because there's a part of the social sciences which they call, somewhat offensively I think, the soft social sciences or the interpretative social sciences. Interpretative social sciences look a lot like critical theory in the humanities or sometimes literary criticism or history, but reflecting on the social reality of human life. So there's an easy relationship between these soft social sciences and humanities approaches. So that's the first place that humanities people go when they reach out to the sciences. But if you want to go into the empirical social sciences, that is when you're using data sets, when you're collecting data, running statistics, you need to worry about a whole bunch of different questions, then you start stretching humanities people into a place where they really start to get uncomfortable. If you go further into the biological sciences and start asking questions about evolutionary theory, building evolutionary models, building computer models that express evolutionary processes, or asking neuroscientific questions and running neuroscience studies or 1,000 other things like that, then you're really stretching humanities people into painful, uncomfortable territory. So I see it as a kind of gradation where the measure is how difficult it is for humanities people to engage.
Right. Well, in terms of your argument, about all of those?
I am. Empirically oriented sciences is the way I'd put it normally. So I might exempt some of the interpretive social sciences and include them in the humanities. The social sciences, sociology particularly, comfortably spreads across that boundary in some of its aspects. So it's really the empirical sciences that I'm talking about when I talk about scientific approaches.
You mentioned something about the ideological differences that are sort of holding up the ability of the humanities and the sciences to get together. Can you elaborate a little bit on, or define a little bit more closely what you mean by the ideological differences?
Right. I think the right analogy here is two lovers who really want to be together but their families object. There's no actual incompatibility between the two people except for the social context and the histories and whatever it is that people think in large-scale terms about these two individuals and what their being together would mean. So that's an analogy, but more concretely and specifically, the post-colonialist, post-structuralist critique of the idea of religion and of any type of science is very powerful within religious studies departments all over the world. I've seen it in China, I've seen it in India, I've seen it here in New Zealand, I've seen it in Australia, and it's certainly very common in the United States and Europe. That particular attitude has a lot to commend it, I think, as I said in the lecture. I mean, the post-structuralist won the debate with the structuralists, I think. But the thing is, you don't need to be afraid of people who are using a different method. What you need to be is ready to correct them, ready to correct yourself in the light of what you learn from them. So the ideology is present in the form of a reactive defensiveness that won't even consider learning from the other, rather than giving it a shot and using the other to refine the way you do your own work, and using your own work as a recommendation to the other so that they can improve what they're doing. Now, you don't see that ideological barrier on the science side. What you see there is an arrogant dismissal of anything that's not doing what we're doing. An arrogant dismissal with contrary to nature exceptions when a humanist comes and talks to them and it makes sense. Right? So that, I suppose you could call that an ideology of arrogance that comes from the fact that sciences hold all the cultural cards. They're the hegemony graspers at the current time in universities. Now, those two forms of ideology produce a politically intractable conflict, arguably, but conceptually there just isn't a conflict. So I go back to the analogy I gave. It's like two lovers.
So without putting words in your mouth, I'll try. So you're really saying that negotiation is what it's all about?
Politically, yes. Yeah. But I've sat down with deans of the college and of the graduate school in my own university in the wake of this decision to allow the religion department to decide what happens in graduate education, focusing just on their areas of expertise, and the decimation that that's causing in our PhD training, not just in scientific study of religion, but in other areas too, such as philosophy of religion. Nevertheless, I sat down with them. Their concern looks totally different than anything related to what I would consider content or intellectual issues. Their concern is focused on institutional survivability, institutional coherence. And what makes sense to them is if their departments inside the college are the focus of what happens in graduate education, and that people outside the college, people in medical school or in public health or in School of Theology or engineering or somewhere else, those people should have their own PhDs. So it's a territory thing. It's not related to these issues we've been talking about. But that's extraordinarily frustrating because in the religion department, it is related to the issues I've been talking about, but at the level of the university administration, they permitted something to happen that I don't think they really understood. So it's not just negotiation, it's also education. Right? The opportunities lost need to be explained, and the possibilities of doing something really special need to be explained to university administrators.
On that very topic, the university has just this year created a Bachelor of Arts and Sciences.
This one?
Yeah, to encourage the cross-pollination you're talking about, which is, fantastic.
Yeah. Well, you also have a religion department that has both humanities and scientific approaches well represented. So good for you, University of Otago.
Richard, Ben, you had a question first. Thank you very much. I mean, there's nothing I really disagree with there. It's in principle. I think, I mean, just to illustrate the practical problem, you talked about recruiting people who could teach across both styles of approach. But of course, in many ways, that's very difficult because people gain PhDs in study of religion often by the kind of micro-study we've talked about. You know, they spend years studying Sanskrit or whatever, or Greek or Latin or whatever languages they need, and then they study the texts and then they write off their PhD, at which point they're not equipped to say anything about the scientific study of religion.
Right.
And of course, on the science side, something similar often happens. So how do you recruit people who could do this? I can understand older people like, you and me. Once we've sort of been trained in an area, then branching out and learning, that's great. But it is really hard to get younger people who could do this, surely.
Yeah, it is. Okay, we've got a chicken and egg problem. In order to solve the problem in the university department level, you need people who can work across both sides of that divide, even though they're always going to be professionally identified with one side or the other, naturally. That's the way PhDs work. But you don't have any people to choose from because no one's training these people in religion. You have to go to an anthropology department or something. Well, there are a few religion departments who are training people to do religious studies in a way that crosses humanities and science boundaries. The University of Aarhus, University of California in Santa Barbara, and until very recently, I'm sad to say, Boston University. We were actually trying to do this inside religion departments, trying to solve the chicken and egg problem. Other people will have to solve it now for a while until we find someplace else to park our efforts in the university. But yeah, it's a problem. So if you go to an anthropology department, and you're looking for someone who can do evolutionary religious studies, you will now and then find someone. And they'll be pretty cluey, because they're a cultural anthropologist, about the sensitivities that humanities people have. Or if you go to, if you want a psychologist of religion, and you go to a psychology department to look for them, you have to look for someone who's actually got the sensitivities built in. Then you bring on a psychologist into your department, but they know how to teach Religion 101, they know enough about religious studies to have conversations with colleagues and so forth. That's how you solve the problem in your own religion department here, by finding people like that. So there is a way through in the meantime, but the ideal method for solving the problem is to have people coming through in religious studies who are trained in both sides. So they're identified with a particular specialisation, but they've got broad training as well, so that they can function well in a religion department. They're the people that religion departments will then turn to fill their positions.
So I want to ask another follow-up question about the training. As someone who's, I guess, got a sort of, we could call it classical religious studies training in my PhD, but before that was involved in the sciences and is now involved in trying to do some empirical work or dipping my toe in. I'm aware of the fact that there's a lot of, there's just basic kind of methods that I would like to be more fluent in, to have a basic grasp on. So how do you train in your program, for example, like, do you have them do statistics? Do you have them do computer modeling? Like, what are the nitty-gritty classes and things? Yeah.
In the traditional PhD study in the United States, you always do 2 European languages. In our particular track within the religious studies PhD, you do 1 European language, because everything in religion and science is in English. You do 1 European language or some language that's required for your research. And the other thing you do is a scientific language of some kind. It might be statistics, it might be computer modelling, it might be geographical information systems, for ecological modelling or something. It might be neural modelling, whatever it is that's going to help you do your research. And we put people in labs for 200 hours. They actually work in a lab for 200 hours alongside people doing lab work, not just washing beakers or something, but doing some serious lab work. where they've proved to be extremely useful because they bring with them a lot of knowledge of the history and philosophy of science. So they know a lot about the practice of science, and they can shed light on what actually happens in the lab processes that the person running the lab often benefits from. So it's not just a one-way learning process. We also put them through 1 year of mathematics and 1 year of biology and physics, running in parallel, a very intensive year, so that they come away with basic information about sciences. They're literate. It's called science literacy. And it's not just popular science. We do the math so that they can understand the physics. But we don't teach it like you would in a physics department. We have a narrative approach to teaching it. So you're talking about equations, yes, but you're describing what the equations mean and why they're important, not making them do problem sets for homework or something like that. So those three things we do on the science side, and then we have an integrative exam when they do their exams, their qualifying exams, which has to be a science humanities thing. It's evaluated using scientists' home field standards and humanities science field, home field standards, depending on what the specific disciplines are. And then their dissertation is written in the same vein with humanities people on there. So we're training a humanities religious studies person, and they're going to be a philosopher or a sociologist or an anthropologist or something. They're going to identify that way. But their specialisation is in the scientific study of religion. And we found that it works well. These people have been placed that way. Every single one of them has gotten a postdoctoral position of some kind, a postdoctoral fellowship or a tenure track position or something. Every single one of them. 0 fails. So that's how we do it.
I have met a few of these people. One person I have in my mind, Connor, he's incredibly impressive. He's in a lot of panels with me at the AAR, and he'll just present empirical findings based on an experiment, but then he'll interpret it in question and answer, quote Mary Douglas and Durkheim, and sort of blow the traditional AAR audience away while still having the empirical chops to blow psychologists away.
Exactly.
It's quite impressive. He's very impressive.
That's how we do it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of people. And these people, like I say, are trained better than I ever was. I relate to what you said. I mean, I've got a science background before I did the PhD in philosophy, but I'm an old dude who learns stuff and brings it in and adapts, stuff like that. But being trained from the beginning would have been incredible.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm interested in your role as editor of the journal because you talked about collaboration in terms of approaches and ideas and concepts, but what about the whole writing process? Because there's something fundamentally different about science and humanities when it comes to that. And the reason behind my question is I've been part of a research group on eye tracking.
Yes.
And we were eye tracking moving images.
Yeah.
So people watching films, and we had neuroscientists and media, film, cultural studies researchers, and the hardest part was always how to write it up, because we just couldn't agree on that.
That's a brilliant question. I totally relate to that question. In the Centre for Mind and Culture, we have a couple of dozen research programs operating. Most of the teams running those research projects are international and definitely multidisciplinary. So we've got computer engineers, neuroscientists, philosophers, religion, anthropologists, whatever that. So we know what you mean exactly. We solved this problem in an interesting way. At least I wouldn't recommend it necessarily to you, but it's worked for us. We first of all, choose a target audience. Is this going to a science venue or is it going to a humanities venue, this article? And normally on most projects, we'll have multiple articles of both kinds. So once we've decided on the audience and the scope of the article, we haggle around until we find out who the first author is. And if it's going to a science journal, typically it'll be a scientist first author, and if it's going to a humanities journal, typically humanities first author. Then they have to choose who their writing partners are going to be. And of course, because we've chosen the journal and the first author, we know what the style of the paper is going to be. So everyone knows who's got to do most of the accommodating. So on the humanities paper with the humanities first reader, the computer engineer in there is maybe baffled, but they know what the rules are, right? They have to follow the rules of the humanities submission. And the same thing on the science side, where the humanities people have to figure out how to organise a science paper and how not to ramble and how to get your results out there cleanly and clearly and not to mix it up with your description of the method and all of those skills that scientists have that come easily to them. So I think about trying something like that, I suppose. If you're working on your eye tracking project, do 2 papers, one for a science journal and one for a religious studies journal or whatever, and see if you can get everyone equally uncomfortable.
Hi. I wonder, when we do the study of religion, is it possible that we can incorporate the religion idea into the scientific theory, such as can we incorporate the idea about the law of karma into the scientific theory about time traveling? Because recently I watched TV series about the 12 monkeys about time traveling, and I wonder if the human can really go back in time, and what would happen to the idea about the law of karma.
Yeah.
That it still makes sense or not, something like that.
Good. I understand the question. There's a branch of religion and science that has nothing to do with the scientific study of religion. It's called religion-science dialogue. And in religion-science dialogue, you have people who are doing confessional theology, that is, they do conceptual work within a particular religious tradition on behalf of that tradition. They're asking questions about their tradition based on something they learn from the sciences. It might be cosmology, it might be new technology and how that affects the way you think about human beings. It might be time travel and the way that affects your conception of Dharma. Anything like that. Inside that world of science-religion dialogue, you see conversations like that happening all the time. Now, in the scientific study of religion, you do not see those conversations because you're using science to study something, religion. Therefore, you're limited by the limitations that are prevalent within the sciences. That is, you have a naturalistic framework, for example, so you wouldn't take the concept of sin or dharma literally. You would think of them as concepts that have a life within a particular community and a tradition. Whereas if you're working in the science-religion dialogue field, you could take Dharma seriously as a thing. You take that for granted and you try and understand how it's affected by the concept of time travel. So there's quite a sharp divide between religion and science dialogue, which we also do at Boston University, by the way, but in a different PhD, and religion and science in the sense of the scientific study of religion.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned the 2 arguments are based around love from a scientific point of view, and the point that if the humanities scholar or academic doesn't take in to what the scientist departments say about it, then the argument could be flawed. So just a sort of metaphysical question about that. Do you think there will ever be a time where scientists and etc. will arrive at a place where there is nothing more to discover, or alternatively, could they agree that not everything can be discovered or explained scientifically?
Yeah, that is a classic question in the philosophy of science. Can scientists ever get to the end of the road? Our experience is every time in the history of science, every time people think they're getting to the end of the road of scientific discovery, something big happens that opens up a whole new area of ignorance. Classic example, end of the 19th century, people thought with Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism and the unification of electromagnetism and optics that we'd actually come to the end of science. It was now just mopping up operations. That was immediately before the special theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, and general theory of relativity, after which gravitational pull forces disappeared and all we've got is warped space-time. I mean, holy moly, an utter transformation in the sciences that was not expected, and it made the arrogance of thinking that everything was all done seem comical. Though I think people have learned from that, and they've learned from all of the other similar mistakes that have been made along the way. I think now scientists generally regard the universe as tractable for scientific inquiry, but we're never really going to get to the bottom of it. Now, there could be things that some people say you'll never be able to study as a scientist. And that would be an interesting, this is where the fight starts within the philosophy of science. Some people, for example, will say supernatural forces. Religions, lots of religions believe in invisible agents, like ancestors or ghosts or gods or something. Well, if those things are real, how will you ever be able to study them? You can't study them, can you? Therefore, there's an in-principle limit on how competent you can be. I think scientists just have to grant that case. You can make all of that stuff implausible by showing that you don't need supernatural causes to explain the world, but you can't ever prove that it's wrong. Right? You can make it implausible, but you can't prove that it's wrong. So I think there are areas that are very important in religion that science can't really deal with very effectively. And instead, it takes a step back and thinks about, why do people believe in supernatural agents? Because it's so common in our species. Not universal. People with autism spectrum disorder frequently do not believe in supernatural agents with the same frequency as people without do, but nearly universal in our species. So that's the way they take the question. But the philosopher is going to want to know, well, if there are supernatural forces, that's pretty important. We really need to know about that. We're not going to be able to count on the sciences to prove or disprove that. All we can use the sciences for is to make more or less plausible competing hypotheses. Hypothesis A, they do exist. Hypothesis B, they don't. See what the sciences have to say about elaborating those hypotheses. And then all you've got is a probabilistic judgment call that you have to make in the end. So science can help that far, but probably no further on certain issues related to religion.
Okay, thank you, Wesley.
Thanks, John.